Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know, during our half-hour episodes, I talk to writers and occasionally other artists about what inspires them, what they're working on, how they got where they are, what they might be planning for the future. We cast a pretty wide net. We've had actors on, we've had musicians, we've had painters, all sorts of wild, creative people. So if you have ideas for guests who might be on the Writer's Block, watch for our address at the end of the program. Send those names in and we'd be glad to consider any suggestions you have. I also want to remind you that many past shows of the Writer's Block are available on tape, old VHS tape, at the library here in Gloucester, the Sawyer Free Library. If you want to see an old show and you happen to still have one of those VHS monitors around, you can go in and take it out as you would a book, watch it at home, and then bring it back. Tonight, I'm happy to say we have two guests, a double treat for our audience, two writers who have recently finished a book titled Fitzhenry Lane, Family and Friends. The two writers are Sarah Dunlap, whom you may remember from an earlier show about 7 or 8 years ago. Sarah lives in Gloucester, and she came to Gloucester in 1973 by way of her birthplace, Texas, and then later Drake, Massachusetts. She went to school and studied Old English literature at Bryn Mawr College and in Pennsylvania. And she was on the show earlier, as I mentioned, because of a couple of books. One, The Jewish Community of Cape Ann, which she co-wrote with Zelly Kaplan, and also an article called Fitzhugh, which was about the breaking news that Fitzhugh Lane wasn't Hugh at all, he was Fitzhenry Lane. The second guest who co-wrote with Sarah Fitzhenry Lane, Family and Friends, is Stephanie Buck. Stephanie is from a coastal community like Gloucester, but it was in England, Bristol. She migrated or emigrated from Bristol, England to Gloucester, another coastal community, in 1970, staying close to her first love, I guess the Atlantic Ocean. She's been here ever since. She studied psychology at London University before coming here, but has since turned herself into an historian and a writer of history concerned with Mary Blood Mellon, one of the contemporaries and a student of Fitzhenry Lane. She wrote the chronology for Mary Blood Mellon during the last fall's Fitzhenry Lane show and Mellon show at the museum here in Gloucester. Sarah and Stephanie, welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm glad you could make it. I want to show the book right away because we're going to plug the daylights out of it and everybody's going to buy it. This is Fitzhenry Lane, Family and Friends, published by
Church and Mason is basically our addresses. I live on Church Street. Sarah lives on Mason Street. So we created a publishing company called Church and Mason.
But it's
also
co-published
with
the Cape Ann Historical.
Cape Ann Historical.
Yes.
So Church and Mason, that distinguished publishing company based here in Gloucester,
Yes.
with the Cape Ann Historical Association,
Yes.
published the book. And when did this appear?
October of 2007.
Let me start with you, Sarah. How did this book come about? When was it conceived? When did you begin?
It began at the same time as the Fitzhugh article began, because it began with Professor Wilmerding's talk here in 2004 when he asked the question, why did Nathaniel Rogers Lane change his name to Fitzhugh Lane? And that was a type of question that we were quite good at looking into at Gloucester Archives. So we at Gloucester Archives Committee started looking into that. And Janie Walsh was the first person to notice that the name change that he asked the legislature for was not from Nathaniel Rogers Lane to Fitzhugh Lane, but Nathaniel Rogers Lane to Fitzhenry Lane. She was looking at a transcript, and so we thought the transcript was wrong. So we went to the next step up, which was a book, and that said Fitzhenry. We thought that was wrong. So several of us jumped into a car and we drove into Mass Archives and found the original piece of paper on which he wrote that he would like to change his name to Fitzhenry Lane. And then
So
we knew.
Then you knew.
We knew that we had a very interesting bit of news.
Stephanie,
And so we started writing then, and this has just been an accumulation of data that we've been gathering ever since, and we sort of squished it, reformed it, shaped it into a book last year.
now, Stephanie, were you in that car that went to Boston?
Yeah, I was amongst that group. I was volunteering at the archives at that time, and then very shortly after that, I think, just shortly after that, I became the librarian archivist at the museum. So that gave us access to all the museums.
You are the
archives.
librarian
Yes.
at the museum now.
Yes.
So you became involved at the same time
Yes.
with the name mystery.
Yes, I was co-writer of the name mystery as well, or the paper on it, yes.
And you mean the Fitz Who paper?
Yes,
Did you co-write that together with
Yes.
with Sarah?
yes.
And were you immediately enthralled with the idea of learning more about
Oh, yes.
Fitzhenry Lane?
Oh, yes. Well, for a start, I worked where we have the largest collection of his paintings. So it was just intriguing to try and find out why the error had occurred and how it had been continued through all these years. We got sidetracked.
The Fitzhenry Lane collection at the museum is really the artistic anchor of the museum.
Yes, it is.
And it must be.
It's the largest collection and single place in the world, and we have, I think, almost all his sketches too, over 100 of those.
And they must be almost all of them invaluable at this point.
Oh yeah.
I know he tried to give the Lyceum, I'm connected with the library, tried to give the Lyceum a painting for auction in the 1850s, and he suggested a price of $50,
Yes.
and they refused it because it was,
They didn't know, they
it was-
didn't
it was
refuse
too
it.
much.
No, they didn't refuse it.
What happened was that they were trying to raise funds to put in, I think it was the library.
To put in, and Samuel Sawyer
Right.
offered $100 if other people would raise 10 times that amount or something.
And
So-
Fitz offered his painting at $50 to raise the money for the $50, and somebody could get that, the painting. And it was for the Sons of Gloucester.
It was offered to the Sons of Gloucester to buy it for $50, and the $50 would be
Go to-
turned over to the library, and no Son of Gloucester
There was a
responded.
notation in the minutes, actually. No Son of Gloucester responded.
So it was not sold.
No.
It was not sold. Nobody bought it.
Quite a bargain, of course.
Yes,
Hindsight,
really.
hindsight, that would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars
yeah.
now. I want to ask now the next step after you discovered the name change, or the mistaken identity of Fitzhenry Lane being called for over a century Fitzhugh Lane. After you discovered that, you mentioned, Sarah, that you, would you say, squidged together some of the material?
Oh, that was
What
just finally when we realized that we had a lot of information. Well, first, one of the things that we noticed right at the very beginning was that there were just many, many mistakes made when in other people's work. Nobody had gone back and really done research. So, for instance, the story about Lane having worked with Clegg and Dodge, there was no Clegg and Dodge. And everything we looked at was either completely wrong or slightly wrong as far as data about living in Gloucester. And so we realized we had an enormous amount of information that should be presented. And the way it was pages and pages of just one fact after another with footnotes. And it was horrible to read. Not that this is wonderful to read, but it flows much better than that first long a collection of facts, and that squishing from that large collection of facts, which we had been collecting for 5 years, was put into a book form and organized last year.
That book was.
That's that book.
That's this book.
That's this
Okay,
book.
I thought for a second you were referring to the earlier,
No.
No,
larger book
No.
by the gentleman whose name I'm not going to remember, published last year on Lane. With
He
all
was
the color
working.
prints. What was the name of the book?
Jim
Craig.
Craig
Jim Craig.
was
thank you.
working not with us, but at the same time on his book.
You said, Sarah just said, Stephanie, that this was less than a page turner. I think you were implying. How would you describe this book, Stephanie? And what's in it? And how would you describe it?
It doesn't tell the whole story because so much of him as an artist has already been told, both by Professor Wilmerding and by Jim Craig and others, that we didn't really go in that direction at all. This is almost an adjunct to their work. We're talking about how his life was here in Gloucester, which, as Sarah said, nobody really seems, as far as we can tell, ever really looked at what was going on in Gloucester and the people that were around him, his neighbourhood, his family at that time. So that's what we did. We had access to all the records, so it was time-consuming. It took us a long time. It was slog, but
Well, this is very, very carefully footnoted. And,
oh yes,
being
and you note they are footnotes, not endnotes.
yes, that's very quaint. Footnotes don't exist anymore.
No, we insisted on it.
Why did you insist on that?
Because both, I think I speak for both of us, found it extremely annoying to be reading something and have to turn to the end of the chapter to find the reference. We thought it should be right on the
So
page.
you brought footnotes back.
And the
We
footnotes
did.
are part of the story, and half of those footnotes are stories in themselves.
I noticed
Many of the footnotes tell things that are rather interesting. Like, there's one little anecdote about. It's not an anecdote. Lane was drawing with his friend Champney towards the end of Lane's life. Champney was a fellow artist in Boston, and he and Champney both had studios in the Tremont Temple. And this was back around 1849, 1850, but even in 1863, 64, they were still drawing together. Champney came out here to Gloucester, and they drew pictures of Folly Cove. And Lane was sitting on land that would have been his great-great-great-grandfather's land when he drew this. And just tying facts like that together, noticing that Lane was back where his great-great-great-grandfather had first settled around 1700, are details that you would find in the footnotes.
I noticed that the last footnote is 591. So there are more, and that's on page 143. So there's quite a number of footnotes per page.
Yes.
I like that, being a history minor myself. I have a question I want to make sure I get to before I ask you to point out some of the details of the book. We mistook his name for Fitzhugh for many, many years, but he changed his name intentionally from Nathaniel Rogers Lane to Fitzhenry Lane, as we now know. Why did he change? Let me ask you first, Stephanie, why he changed, I know you can't read minds, but give us a guess. Why did he change his name from Nathaniel Rogers to Fitzhenry?
We don't know. It's the short answer. We have theories in there about it. One of the men that was a friend or an associate of his quotes him at one point saying, "I'm damned if I won't change his name," or something like this. So he must have objected to Nathaniel Rogers. We don't know why. We can't find any. There's no Nathaniel Rogers around that we think would have offended him so that he wanted to change it. There are no Fitzes in his family. There are some Henrys, but why he picked Fitzhenry, we don't know.
And you've applied all your psychology from London University?
Yeah,
You-
yeah.
and,
Not all of it, part of it.
Sarah, do you have a view of why that might have
No, we just
been
don't
his
know.
decision?
We've pondered, we've thought, we've scoured the records. We don't know. But it was not unusual for people to change their names. Many people changed their names, either just one name or the whole name. Harvey Coffin Mackey, who lived right next to where the Cape Ann Historical is. He was born Samuel Guy Whittemore. He changed his name when he was about 35, 36. The day that Lane changed his name, he was one of about 85 people in Massachusetts who were changing their names. So it was not at all unusual.
Was this consistent historically, year after year after year, or was there a
yes.
vogue of
No,
some sort
there's
during,
a book that's
during that
about
period?
that thick of name changes from about mid-1700s to 1880 or something like that.
These were people not trying to hide
No.
European backgrounds or trying to fit in the Yankee culture.
I
They
mean,
were
it's
Yankee
like-
name to another Yankey
Yes,
name.
exactly.
Anticipating the movies in some obscure way. This book is titled Family and Friends, and I wonder if, Sarah, can I start with you? Explain the structure of the book.
Well, it starts out with Lane's ancestors and then his parents, and it turns out that his parents were step-siblings, that his one grandparent married another grandparent, and the two combined families had the father and mother living there. So these two people, the mother was much older than the father, grew up together in the same house. And that is a fact that I don't think has ever been
No.
noticed by anybody else.
His mother?
Fitzhenry Lane's mother was a stepsister of Fitzhenry Lane's father.
Yeah, stepsisters. They weren't blood related. They were just.
Okay.
She was Lane's grandfather's daughter, and his father was Lane's grandmother's son, and the grandmother married the grandfather.
Got to buy the book to get that straight. You have a genealogy.
There's a
in
family
there.
tree in the back.
These are all
helps.
Haskells.
They're
They're all Haskells. So.
You have, after the Lane background, Stephanie, many sections, little miniature chapters on individuals who are friends or
Right.
business associates or fellow artists.
Not necessarily, no, not fellow artists. Well, Mary Mellon, I suppose you could say. But mostly what we did was we looked at the people that Lane mentioned in his will, specifically left individual items to, or at one point he named people to share $500 that he was leaving. And we looked at them. We wanted to see who they were, what their relationship was to him, why he picked these particular people.
I want to ask you a couple mechanical questions, or not mechanical, but interpersonal questions about how two writers co-write. Did you divide up the work to be done, or did you do one page, Stephanie, and then Sarah, you did another? And did
Now,
you
novelists do that, but we didn't.
was it a completely smooth process the
There
whole
was
time?
there were a lot of people doing the research.
Yeah.
And so the facts got put onto my computer. So I had this mass of stuff. Stephanie
I became involved in the Mary Mellon
Mary
thing,
Mellon.
so I did that.
Stephanie is the world's leading expert on Mary Mellon.
Congratulations.
Thank you. For the moment, that'll change, I'm sure. And what happened was, because all the facts were on Sarah's computer, that Sarah basically sat down and started trying to compile these into some kind of book form. And she'd print out reams of paper and facts in written form, I can't think of the word, and she'd hand them to me, and then I'd go through them and say, no, we've said this 2 pages before, this paragraph needs to be here, this thing that is to be completely rewritten. And it just went on like this. It just sort of flowed like that.
And
And
then
the
last summer, I went off on a vacation with what we thought was the final thing, and I read it, and it was the most horrible book. So then I went home and just cut and slashed and rearranged and tried to make every chapter sort of focused on something or other, so it would be easier to read.
Was that a tough job?
That was very tough.
And recognizing that it wasn't really a page
And
turner?
had to leave out so much.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We're already working on notes and additions. There is so much that we left out of there that we could put in. There's more research that's coming along that we're doing, that other people are feeding us little snippets.
Was the process smooth?
I think it was, actually.
Yeah.
Were you at each other's throats occasionally
No.
about
No.
that paragraph's going to stay?
No.
No,
the
no, we
paragraph's
were,
gonna
we
leave?
were very polite to each other.
Are you going to do another one?
We're doing notes and
additions.
additions.
Just notes and additions?
Yeah.
Will that be as big as this?
Maybe.
What we're hoping is that we will each take turns writing notes and additions for the Cape Ann Historical Newsletter.
Picking one particular thread and following that.
We should ask, I should ask for the audience, who is Mary Blood Mellon?
Good question. Even though I'm the world's leading authority, I'm not 100% sure myself. She was born probably in Vermont, although her family came from Sterling, Mass, Western Massachusetts. She had 4 brothers and 2 sisters. She came from a large family. She showed promise as a young woman, as an artist. She married a Universalist minister. Being a minister and being a Universalist, they moved a lot in their years around, mostly around Massachusetts. One little sojourn out into New York, but mostly around Massachusetts, mostly this end of Mass. His brother was also a Universalist minister, and it was his brother, W.R.G. Mellon, that was the Universalist minister here in Gloucester in between 1855 and 1860. Now, it seems that Mary may have met Fitz when he was in Boston. Possibly, that's one of my theories, is that she may well have come up because her brother-in-law was also in Cambridge at that point, a Universalist minister in Cambridge. So she may well have come to visit her brother and seen some of Fitz's work at the Athenaeum, where he was exhibiting at that time. Got an introduction, and then when W.R.G. came up here for those 5 years, it was very easy for her to come up, stay with him and his wife and their 3 girls, and study with
and
Fitz.
study under him.
And they lived, W.R.G. lived what was then Spring Street, which is right at the top of where sort of the Browns Mall is now, right at the top of Duncan Street, Pleasant Street, and Fitz was just down the road in the stone house.
So she studied under him, and the recent
studied.
exhibit last fall compared and contrasted their
Right, she was a copyist.
their work.
Well, she copied his work. We don't actually know of any extant work of hers, of her own doing. All the stuff that we have, that we've seen, is copies, except for one small one, but I won't go there. She also did copy Richer. Britcher. We found one copy of a painting of a gentleman called Britcher. But apart from that, it seems to be that she was a copyist, which was the way that women artists got anywhere back in those days. They weren't considered able to create their own works. They were copyists. But she was an artist. That's how she made her living. Her husband died fairly young, about 20 years before she did. He was in his 40s. And from then on, she appears on the censuses as an artist, and she had studios, and that's what she was doing.
Sarah, I was interested in your background. You've been working in the archives and in the glamorous City Hall basement for many, many years.
Yes.
Is your archival work mostly now occupied with Lane and his
Heavens,
and his
no.
circle?
No, no, not at all. No, we're still just doing basic requests from other people and organizing new records that come into the archives. But every now and then, I still uncover a new fact about Lane by going through the city records. We have more information about the Civil War records of his family.
So he's not exhausted. The
He's
Lane.
not
no.
at all exhausted, no.
I've seen earlier articles about him. They're so sparsely annotated, or so sparsely filled in. He was almost a cipher. Much less so now.
Much less so. You have to interpolate to get at the man, but there is a great deal more of
Triple
information
H,
to work with.
That's where historians have a good time. The director, Andrew Love, just gave me the 2-minute sign, so I'm going to have to begin to wrap up. I want to thank you very much, Stephanie Buck and Sarah Dunlap, for coming down on the writer's block and talking about your brand new book, Fitzhenry Lane, Family and Friends, available everywhere on Cape Ann and on Amazon.
Not,
We
No.
don't know.
We don't know yet.
We don't know. Cape Ann Historical is dealing with
Cape Ann
this,
Historical,
is organizing these
soon to
sales.
be available everywhere,
Yes.
and I'm sure on Amazon. So go out and buy it, everyone. Thanks. I want to thank everybody in TV land, too, for being with us. If you've learned something about Gloucester's heritage, about Fitzhenry Lane and specifically that great artist's background from Stephanie Buck and Sarah Dunlap, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.